5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and thank you, partner. Take a deep breath, and then go, oh. So it is my great pleasure to invite somebody to talk for a little bit who's a dear friend of mine, who's helped me get so much better with so many things that I just don't have a lot of experience with. And as somebody who often feels like they don't belong, this is my little personal story about this person. And I don't know if I ever told you this. In a conversation, I was wrestling with being a cisgendered white person who's sometimes invited into places where white cisgendered people and sometimes cisgendered males aren't allowed. And I was having a whole struggle about how do I do this? What do I do? And then Ignacio said, well, you know, you're kind of like an M to M. And I'm like, what? What does that even mean? And Ignacio goes, you know, here's some places you should go. Like, read up on like trans experience, because there's a lot of experience about, you know, F to M's all of a sudden kind of not belonging in, if they identified as a lesbian before somebody, all of a sudden they don't belong in lesbian community, and there's this kind of outsider thing, but it's their community, and you should just go hang out with some of that stuff and think about that. And I was like, thank you so much. And then that helped me grok a bunch of things I'd never had access to. So it's my great pleasure to invite Ignacio to come up here, and just whatever spills out of their mouth is probably highly useful for educators everywhere. And thanks for being here. Ignacio Rivera. All right, hang on. We're getting the Janet Jackson on. Can I put this in your pocket?
Yeah. Okay. Does that make a difference? Oh. Okay. I can't hear it though. Okay. All right. So the round table this afternoon is around. I want to be talking to folks about the U.S. Trans Survey that's coming out in August, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But if you yourself are trans, if you have trans people in your life, chosen family, blood family, lover, if you work with trans people, I would really ask for you to come and know what's happening with the U.S. Trans Survey, so that you can let other people know, and hopefully you can help out with some outreach efforts. It's the largest survey ever conducted in the United States around trans and gender nonconforming and non-binary people. So I'll leave that at that, and we can talk about that later. At lunchtime in that area. Okay, that feels weird. All right, so literally this workshop that I do is usually 3 hours or longer. So this 1 hour will not do it that much justice. I hope it'll give you a little something to start having some conversations about. And this is what I do. I go and talk about these things with folks. So if you want to talk to me further, let me know. And so I pulled a lot of information from a lot of different stuff. So I literally just created a PowerPoint like 10 minutes ago. So I'm going to be going back and forth between a document and a PowerPoint. Let's see if it works. I don't know. But I have a lot to say about it. Okay, so what I've called this is talking about intersectionality within sex ed, sex therapy, in the sex industry, right? And why is intersectionality so important? So why is talking about intersectionality among the work, among the work that you do important? Like, why would you want to sit here and talk about intersectionality? How does it connect with your work? I'm very interactional, so I'm going to ask you questions. You're jumping ahead. That's okay. I want to know what you think you know intersectionality is, and then we can go in. And I do have a definition to share with folks. So,
You can't be what you can't see?
Huh?
Can't be what you can't see.
Can't be what you can't see. Tell me more about that. What do you mean?
If I am born a person of color, I may not aspire to be president. We have not had, prior to Barack Obama, a person of color in a position of authority and power like that in the United States.
Okay.
So you can't be what you can't see. Same with gender nonconforming. Same with sexual orientation situations.
Okay.
So
and I get what you're saying. Like, you can't be what you can't see. But I'll rework that and say it's harder to realize something when you haven't seen anyone that looks like you in that position. So it is possible to do it, but it's a lot more harder, a lot of obstacles. So I get what you're saying. Thank you. Anyone else?
are you trying to display right now?
I am going to...
the idea of connecting
it's not
people
working.
to get them to open their minds about how they're dealing with things, because for so many people who think that because they hear this thing about having privilege, it really shuts down their willingness to open anything, and it's really hard to challenge people, which I think we really need to do if we're going to move the conversation forward. So presenting intersectionality to people who aren't familiar with the term is a way to help them realize that you're not the enemy,
Right.
you're as fucked as the rest of us in different ways.
Yes. Thank you.
A lack of this conversation, for me at least, it just, you end up passing the message of the oppressor. That message keeps getting passed on from generation to generation until we start listening to one another. Then we start creating new stories. But if we don't, the privileged, powerful message or information or education gets passed.
Thank you. One more? Anybody else? We have two. We'll take two more.
I'll be very fast. Since I work in military healthcare, I think the intersectionality is really... Sorry. Oh, I will be louder. Okay, so intersectionality is valuable for at least my work in military healthcare, because the lack of intersectionality, the lack of awareness about it, actually creates health disparities.
Yes, yes. And we have one last person over here.
In whatever work we do, the vocabulary we use has a way of perpetuating the status quo. And us learning or becoming familiar with intersectionality will change the way we interact with our people.
Yes. Yes, thank you. Okay. Thank you, everyone. So I want to... this probably isn't going to work, so if it doesn't, that's totally fine. No problem. We'll just do it the way I always do it, old school. Okay, it's all about the old school. All right, so I wanted to do a little exercise. So everyone has paper and a writing utensil? Yeah? Okay. So I want you to list at least 10 things, just at least 10 things that describe who you are as a person in this world, right? How you identify. So just write 10 things that identify if you're a woman, a man, you know, a lesbian, if you're a mother, if you're any of these things, just make a list of about 10. Things that are important to you, that's really core to your identity. Right? Okay. Anybody want to share some of the things that they wrote down? Just a couple of popcorn things. Anybody want to just call out?
Sex therapist, hetero, educated, video gamer, ADHD, father, married.
Okay. Thank you. Anyone else want to?
Mother, entrepreneur, goddess, lioness, rebel, lightworker, healer, lover, friend.
Okay.
Turn the mic on.
Mom, disability advocate, friend, black, southern.
Poly, bisexual, submissive, little woman, sex encourager, white.
All right. Thank you. Okay, so everybody has their list. Now I want you to look at that list, and I want you to cut that list in half. Throw out half of that list. Now you slashed it in half. How was that process for you to slash it in half? Why is it challenging?
You feel like all of these things are part of your identity.
Mm-hmm.
Well, not that one, I guess.
Yeah. Right.
I found it more empowering. It really defines
Mm-hmm.
what's good to our essence.
You found it empowering. Okay, so now I want you to take that and slash it and just choose one. Just one. Pick one. From the 10 that you started with, just pick one. What was the one that you picked? Friend. Okay.
Rebel. Rebel.
Rebel. Mm-hmm. I want to get some folks in the back too.
Tantrika. Tantrika. Determined nomad.
Spiritual.
Goddess.
Father.
Queer.
Smile.
Prana.
And we have one more here.
Beautiful.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Now, if that, so that, how was that process, just picking just one, the one thing that you're going to be identified for? All right. It was easy?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, it was scary. Like, I didn't want to share mine because sorry, I hope you don't mind me cutting in, but it was really scary for me because that one thing is more dangerous.
How so?
So I'm queer, and because it's a dangerous thing, and because being queer in some spaces can be really, really dangerous, so that's the thing I'm really known for.
Mhm.
That certain spaces become automatically less accessible, become automatically more threatening. I become automatically more other.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes I want to hide my labels because those are really important. Because,
Sorry. No, I can't. Yeah, because sometimes I want to hide my labels because I need to feel safe enough to actually occupy the space.
Right. We have a comment back here.
For me, picking just that one thing, okay, being a mom is, the most important thing in my life. However, that's not all there is to me. And
Right.
so therefore just picking that one thing, I was just like, but it always, if you say that, then it has all these connotations about that's what this person is. So
Right.
that was
Right.
hard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one.
Yeah, I think for me it was like kind of shameful because it's like, oh, I'm in a position where I can throw away all these other ones and like sort of go by the one that I can conveniently happily choose. So I was like, it just was like a reminder of privilege because the one that I went was just like educated.
Mm-hmm.
So I was like, oh, okay, but I'm in a position where I can sort of throw away a lot of the other ones and get away with it, kind of thing.
Right,
so,
right.
Yeah.
And let's take one more right here.
Oh, I have the mic.
Okay.
Over here.
Also, one and
It's okay.
two. Uh-huh.
There's also this feeling of being enough. I also chose queer, and I was really feeling conflicted because what if I'm not queer enough? Then I'm nothing. What if I'm not male enough? Well, I'm not male, but if I chose that, then I'm nothing, and that's kind of stressful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess like my feelings were a mix of Adam's and Heather's comment in terms of like even cutting the list in half and then cutting it to one. It was like, well, do I choose the one that is most important to me or one that people keep identifying me as?
Right.
And what is more convenient? And like, do I choose like, I don't know, one of the many that I wrote was Latina, but then I'm white passing. So I'm like, do I really like feel like that's not a thing that's a thing that is very privileged for me. It's like, yeah, but I mean, they're still gonna treat me a certain way. and then queer, but then am I queer enough? And like it was a lot of feelings of like, what do I want to hide? Why do I want to like, what is safe to hide? And I don't know.
Right. So it's complicated. It's definitely complicated. And for, you know, for folks who say it was completely simple just to pick one, I want you to really think about what that means. If you only had that one thing that you identified as all the time, would that represent you as a whole? And you brought up something really important in terms of you can identify yourself any way you want, but the world will always see you, and it might be something completely different. It might not match how you see yourself, and that is going to have impact on how you get treated, services you get, where you have access to, all of these things, right? And then thinking about privilege. This conversation about intersectionality has a lot to do with privilege and oppression on a systematic scale. So we're going to talk about what the definition of intersectionality is. I had it nice and, you know, for the thing, so now I have to do the thing that you were doing, Reed, as we get older. Right? It's like I got to put them on, take them off. Okay. What is intersectionality? Intersectionality is a concept often used in critical theory to describe the ways in which oppressive institutions are interconnected and cannot be examined separately from one another. The concept first came from legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989 and is largely used in critical theory, especially feminist theory, when discussing systematic oppressions. When possible, no, that's it. Okay. So it's about one thing cannot be viewed without the other. It's almost to the idea is like an oppression to one is an oppression to all, because there is a connection, something that connects us all. And we want to think about this kind of oppression in terms of not, there are many levels of this. There's there's internal, there's individual, there's intergroup, and there's institutional. So we want to talk about the institutional and go down. We almost often forget about how the institutional aspect of it, which is the thing that maintains discrimination and oppression, right? If we talk to an individual and say, you're being a racist asshole, you're only talking to that individual, right? But it's not tackling the larger issue of how all systems are a part of this ongoing racism, sexism, transphobia, all of these things. It's integrated into the systems. So that's what we need to be tackling and talking about. So in our work, a lot of times when I've gone to events or anything like that, or when I go do workshops at schools or groups, the things that are usually said is, we want to do sensitivity training. We want to talk about diversity or diversifying. We want to talk about inclusion, and we want to talk about integration. And I want to step away from using those words. For me, using those words kind of insinuates that you're starting from a power privilege and we're trying to bring others along to join us in our quests and our ideas and our things, because somehow that group is just so far behind. They need to just know what's happening over here, right? So for me, I think about it in the terms of I want to be thinking about systematic forms of oppression. I want to think about multiple oppressions that happen to folks. Privilege is really important, and also about coexistence. This is what I continually say. I want to coexist with people. I don't want to be an afterthought and included. I want to be a part of a system where these things are constantly being talked about, that we're being challenged on. I mean, me up here talking about this by no means means that I am a total expert in intersectionality. It's a lifelong journey that happens, and the process of it is constantly checking ourselves, being checked by others, and learning and continuing. And so my process right now is about really learning more about folks with who are disabled, disabled community. So how do I, as a person who is able-bodied, talk about coexistence and in the events that I create and the workshops that I do? And that's always a process for me, because I'm not a person with a disability. I will never know what it feels like to be a person with a disability. And so a white person will never know what it feels like to be a person of color. It's just no way. We can talk about it, we can share experiences, and then we talk about all these the forms of oppression that I'm talking about. So I like to put this in the context of thinking about movements, right? And the movements that historically have happened. So let's think about the women's movement. So the women's movement has had many iterations, like the feminist movement. And when we think about the feminist movement, when it was, starting up and gaining a lot of momentum about, equal pay, and just a woman's right to vote, all of these issues that have been, a battle for women. In that movement, the movement was very much a white woman's movement. Out of the feminist movement came out of that was the Chicana feminists, black feminists, First Nations feminists, like all of these different legs of what a feminist movement was supposed to be, right? Because women of color were not being addressed in that movement. Right? They could not think about intersectionality in that space. It was about being a woman, but when they tried to incorporate, they weren't incorporating class, they weren't incorporating race, they weren't incorporating a lot of things, lack of accessibility. So the work that the feminist movement or the white feminist movement was doing really left out in huge chunks women of color. Right? And in the way things were being organized and the ways things were being talked about. We could think about the LGBT movement, or I should say the LG, or maybe the G, then the LG, then the LGB, now the LGBT, then the LGBTIQ, a letter is always added afterwards because, people are learning and that process, right? And so the LGBT movement, again, has been more privileged, a more white movement, and even the issues that we deem the gay agenda, right? For a long time, I've been in the LGBT movement for a while, and the agendas that have been created for us on a national level were not my agendas. Those are not my agendas at all, but they were deemed the queer or LGBT agenda for the movement, and these were the important issues that we were going to be fighting for. Now, one example is gay marriage. I feel like if people want to get married, that's a beautiful thing. I think that's a personal thing. I don't think that the state should have anything to do with that. That being said, I know that people want to get married for a lot of different reasons, whether it's economic, immigration. There's a lot. Again, we're talking about intersectionality here. It's not a simple answer. But one thing that the gay movement did was made marriage the end-all, be-all issue that will make us all equal if we pass gay marriage. That was a mistake. That was a single issue politic. That's what happened, and that's what we consistently do. We pick one issue, and we say, this is it. We're going to fight for this, and when we get this, we're going to get equality. Bullshit. Marriage has gone, and what's still happening? Black trans women are being murdered on a daily basis. 11 trans black women or women of color have been murdered in the United States since the beginning of the year. Nobody's talking about that. We're talking about homelessness, trans youth, LGBT youth on the street. Talking about no jobs. We're talking like all of these things that are supposed to be a basic human right to survive and to live and to flourish in this world aren't happening. But gay marriage was put at the forefront. Billions of dollars were put into that. And now that it's passed, people are scrambling and wondering what next. What is the next thing? Now, if the work was created in the context of intersectionality, talking about all types of issues, about how we sustain ourselves and how possibly marriage could be a one of the links in how we sustain ourselves as a community, right? That might have looked a little different than saying once we gain marriage, we are all equal, which is not true. A lot of us don't want to get married. And some people don't have the resources to even do that, or what that could look like, right? Any questions so far? No? Okay. No? Okay, good. So let's think about the core of your work and I'm going to talk about sex as your work. If you're selling sex toys, if you're doing workshops around sex, if you're a sex therapist, your work at the core is sex, right? So when you think about about that work, keep that in mind at the back of your head, and I want to ask you a couple of questions. So, historically, how have we, when I say we, and I'm putting this in the context of, North America, there might be folks that are not from North America, because that's what I know. So in the context of North America and historically, how have we learned about sex? Porn? Hearsay? Church? Experimentation, trial and error, fairy tales, yeah. Books, fears, movies. I mean, it's all over the place, right? Your friends who are younger than you telling you how you have sex and how it goes, right? So it's all a wonder a lot of times. And even now, with a room full of people who work in sex, there are so many communities that do not get this information. Not at all. It is something that it is just not attainable, not touchable, and it's very privileged. Being here, talking about sex, having sex be the core of your work is a huge privilege. To talk about that in the midst of poverty, violence, and all that stuff. Why would sex education be so much more important than how to live and how to feed yourself and an apartment and all these things? So when you think about intersectionality, it's about how this work feeds this work and vice versa. How are these things linked? And sometimes we can't see that link very well, but we need to be seeing that link in intersectionality, because a lot of times when we talk about, oh, this event is so white, and why do people of color not come? Why do trans people not come here? And with those questions, I think the idea is okay, but you're asking the wrong questions, right? It's not why people of color or trans people or women or people with disabilities are not here. Is it, what could I do? What am I missing that doesn't allow for this to be seen as a safer space or a place where folks could be here and express themselves and learn, right? Because let's be real. All of you can say, and I'm sure you could all agree with me, that these spaces have been historically white, right? And we talk about it all the time. And why are these spaces historically white? And it is because I think in large part about oppression and about historically that this is something that is seen as something fun to do, that it doesn't connect to the lives or the discrimination and lived experiences of folks that are not historically in the room, right? So we think about it as, oh, I'm skipping ahead. So we said where we learn sex, right? These are all the different ways that we learn about sex. And even some of us here, I didn't learn about sex. I always joke, my mother still hasn't taught me about sex, right? I learned in such fucked up ways. You know, I'm a survivor, and there was just a lot of messed up messaging around what sex was, what relationships look like, all that stuff, and also the having the agency to talk about these things in community, that it's not, with my friends now, we could talk about sex so openly. If I go back home and have my childhood friends there, we don't talk about sex. That's just not something you discuss, right? So let's think about, historically again, who has had the right to have sex, to have pleasure? Men. That's true. Men are at the top of that. That's true. That is true. Married people, yes. Wealthy people. White people. Beautiful people, right? Such beautiful people, right? Yes, able-bodied people, skinny people, or people people at the margins, right? Someone, folks who might be big, fat, and people who are skinny, and people call them twigs. These are not the people that are visually pleasing to watch having sex, right? Who else? Older people. Authority.
Older people is relative. How about fertile people?
Okay, fertile people. Yes. Hetero. All right. Neurotypical. Yes. Monogamous. Yes. Right. So we have an idea of who gets to have sex, because we hear it all the time. Even when you see a porn with someone who might have a little bit more wrinkles, it's like, oh my God, it's so disgusting. Somebody who's a little bigger, why is that person naked, right? It's like we create these rules about who we get to see, who is sexy, who gets to have these relationships, right? And a lot of people fall into that in terms of different body types, right? Because a lot of particular body types are, we see in the media and stuff, it's really based, body image is based on white beauty. It is not based on people of color beauty. I think what we see as beautiful in the black community is really different than what we see in white community. And when I hear like a white woman saying, "Oh my God, my ass is so huge," I'm like, "Yeah, that's right." You know, and I'm not saying that all black people, you know, this is like not a blanket statement, but it's like it varies a lot. It varies a lot in how beauty is seen and how hair is worn, the clothing you wear, all of those things, right? Okay. What historically would have been taboos associated with sex? Yeah, gay sex. Bad, right? Yes. Children, yes. Kink, yes. Group sex, incestuous, yes. Michael Jackson. Don't be talking about Michael. Yes, okay. Yeah, if you have lots of sex, yes. Fetishes. Multiple partner. Yes. Yes. So there are a lot of taboos associated with sex, and a lot of those taboos are very much connected to oppression, right? Because if you think about it, it kind of focuses on, you know, women, gay people, fat people, old people, you know. So if you go down the list, you get to see that there's a connection with the oppression and who shouldn't be having sex, right? So then when you think about who is usually in the rooms and who we're talking to constantly, and you think about those taboos, it's very clear to see why it is not a community that is very diverse. Right? There are a lot of obstacles, a lot of things put in place that really make that very difficult, right? So for me, and for instance, oh God, how many years ago? 15, 20 years ago, I guess. I don't know, going into the kink scene, walking in and probably seeing, you know, one other, maybe a second person who was visibly person of color. Was just like, wow. I mean, being there was amazing. I was like, oh my God, a whole new world. This is great. But I was like, I feel uncomfortable because I just don't see anybody here like me. This is not what I'm used to. It was really difficult. And the first time someone came up to me, it was a white woman who said, I want to tie you up and flog you. I lost my shit. I had to get out of there. I was like, and for me, it was just like, how could she say this to me? I'm black. What the hell? Like, she's not thinking about slavery and all this stuff, right? For me, all of these things were connected. This is not for every person of color. Every person of color has their own journey, how they step into these spaces and stuff. But for me, it was really clear that I needed someone to see me outside of this space and inside of this space, and to negotiate play and sex around that. So that was very linked to me. That act of a white woman asking me that, I was like, oh my God, this is just too much. I have to go, right? But one of the things that ends up happening in these kind of instances is that as people of color, or as people with disabilities, or as trans people, or as poor people, we go into these spaces despite all of the shit, right? We have to do it, right? So a lot of times people say, well, you know, if people of color wanted to be here, they should just be here. Which is bullshit. I'll just say that. It's not that simple, right? And then when we do that, it's a lot of emotional energy. It is a lot. It is navigating being the other. That's one. It is navigating people's learning experience as you're there, right? Because no matter what, you are a teacher as the other. You will always be that teacher. So you have to think about, I'm stepping into this space and I have to be ready for this. This is the job that I am in holding to myself right now. And it is a lot of work, and sometimes you just can't do it, and other times you can. As educators, I think we've created that idea in our heads. It's like, this is the work that I'm going to do, and this is the emotional energy I'm going to take on, right? And that's a lot of work. A lot of people don't want to do that. Right, so when you go into these, when an event is happening, people are like, I'm not going because it's going to be all white, right? And there's a cycle that ensues, right? A cycle that ensues. It's like, if you're not doing the work to get them in there, then it's not going to happen. But then if they don't come to, interact, then it's hard, right? So it's this cycle that all of these things need to be happening at the same time to make it work. But I think that from a privileged standpoint, that work has to be something that is important to you and a part of the core of your work, right? Because if you're wanting to get more clients that are people of color, if you're trying to do more outreach or do workshops for people of color or people with disabilities, anything like that, just to get the numbers, just to get the visuals, just to get that picture on your website, just to do that, it is not going to work. It is pretty much the same as single issue politics, right? Because there is no complexity about it, basically. It is just, I want these faces. I want people to know that they can come. So let's take a picture of here. But is it integrated into the system, right? What is your system? And a lot of times, any kind of group or any kind of work or business that we do, of course, comes from us, from our own personal experiences, right? And so we pour that into our work. But there comes a time, if you want sustainability and if you want a coexistence per se in your work, then that work needs to be done. Because now if you're comfortable and that privilege just works fine for you, then you could just not do anything and it'll just stay the same. And the funny thing is that you actually don't have to, right? As white folks or people who are privileged, you really don't have to do anything. You could just exist the way you want and it'll be just fine for you, right? And so that's also the piece there, is that it's about making that commitment and to why intersectionality is important and should be important at the core. As the United States shifts in demographics and all this, is this important to you? All right. So, expanding your work as sex. So I think that we have seen, like I said, work look like privileged and pleasure-based. So a lot of times people say, oh, I'm in sex education, or I'm a sex therapist or anything. Oh, that's fun. You know, that's like, it's not seen as very political. It's seen as just a very privileged standpoint, right? It's also been seen as a reactionary political thing, right? So kinksters are out and about. People are seeing more of this in the world, but kinksters are getting their children taken away. You know, polyamorous couples are, you know, being taken to court because they're not taking care of their children properly, right? So all of these legal ramifications are happening because sex is coming out, you know, in the forefront much more than ever. It's not in the, you know, in the dark. So as that happens, a lot of legal stuff happens depending on what state you live in. So if this is happening, then reactionary stuff. So there are a lot of organizations that are working on helping individuals, groups, families deal with these ramifications of sex being out in the open. But I also think there's another political aspect to it that we don't really talk about, or that people aren't, don't make that connection. And it is, you know, when I'm talking about the historical oppression, that political piece, that it's based in history and it's based in oppression. So let's think about some of the ways in which sex, or the work of sex, is connected to these systematic forms of oppression. And that would be, just to name a few, the sterilization of poor women and women of color and people with disabilities. Right. Sorry. The sterilization of poor women, women of color, and people with disabilities, or women with disabilities, right? Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. Yeah. The respectability politics, you said, being the right type of rape victim. Yeah. Yeah. Then there is sex ed in the schools. Recently there was sex abstinence until marriage sex education. Did people heard about this? Right. Everybody should have heard about this, right? Bullshit, right? And what most people don't know, that the abstinence until marriage sex education came through welfare reform. Do people know that? Yes, it came through welfare reform. The 1996 welfare reform put billions of dollars in not having sex education, taking away condoms and things like that, and just teaching abstinence. That was it. And it came through welfare as also with the fatherhood initiative and family reunification stuff, which is very problematic, a very heterosexist framework. And it also put women with their abusers again. And they gave a lot of incentives for women to stay with the fathers of their children to get the little bit of money they were getting each month. But I could talk about that a lot. But it came through welfare reform. So a lot of these things who were really targeted towards poor women and women of color, right? Then there's, we don't have them on the books anymore, but sodomy laws. Sodomy laws were in the books for a very long time. And sodomy just didn't mean, male on male anal sex. Really, sodomy is actually anything other than missionary, if people didn't know that. It's just, but people tend to think it's just gay male sex. But in some states, it was anybody who had anal sex. And in other states, it was men who have anal sex. So that was taken off the books with, the Texas case, where, thank you, where a couple were basically having sex in their house, a gay couple, and a neighbor saw them through the window, called the cops busted in. And they were arrested. And so that lawsuit changed sodomy laws and slowly but surely across the country, right? And I talked about welfare reform. We talked forced or coerced birth control, also through welfare reform, right? Getting poor women to get implanted with these devices so they won't have more children, because God damn it, they have so many children and we have to take care of them, which is also bullshit. Homosexuality as a mental illness, which was in the I always say DMV, DSM. In the DSM, that was taken out, but transgender has come up right behind it, right? Then we have, there's always the fight with the trans community around how to word, or if it's medicalized. Yeah. And congruency, they're fighting with the using the word congruency over disorder, but it's in there. That's the big fight. And I see reparative rape, domestic violence, reproductive rights. I mean, I can go on, and this is sex, right? We're talking about sex, not just the pleasure base, but how sex is permeated in a way in terms of like how it connects with the oppression that we're living. And when I think about this list, I think about who it is affecting, and historically it has affected women, it has affected poor women, it has affected people with disabilities, queer people. Right, so there is a constant thing and a link. When I look at the language that has been used throughout history to talk about these specific things, the language is so similar. It's so similar, talking about how these, how we talk about poor women, how we talk about women on welfare, how we talk about teen pregnancy. All of these things have a very, very similar language. And so I talked about some of the systems, and I wish I would have written it down, but oh, this is my alarm going off telling me I have 10 minutes. Okay, I gotcha. Thank you. Okay, so I'll quickly go over this. So as I said before, we think about it individually, right? We say that person's a racist, that person's a sexist, that person's this, right? And instead of thinking about it on a larger systematic framework. So I'll say the system, I'm going to talk about some systems and talk about the manifestations of those systems. So there's the system of heterocentrism or heteronormality, or there's a lot of different ways people say it. There's that system, and the manifestation of that is homophobia, transphobia, biphobia, lesbophobia, sexism, right? There is absolutely a clear connection for me with the oppression of women and homophobia. It is an oppression or a gross negativity against femininity and anyone who denounces male or masculinity. That is super linked. It is very much linked, and we should think about that. When we add race and class and all that to that, it becomes a really difficult thing. The gender binary. The gender binary is the system, and how it's manifested, again, is through transphobia, homophobia, and sexism. And a lot of these manifestations are the same. We got the system, and they manifest themselves exactly the same, right? We have white supremacy is the system, and racism is the thing that keeps it in place, right? We continue that, right? We have patriarchy is the system, and the manifestation, again, is homophobia, transphobia, sexism. We have the system of body norm, and the way that's manifested is through ableism, fat phobia, or fat oppression, and transphobia, right? It's about what is the body norm, right? And I would also say racism in that, how it's manifested, racism. We have capitalism is the system, classism is the manifestation of that, right? So when we think about these systems, we have to think about it in a larger context about how when things are systematically oppressive, it's about how the forms that we get that we fill out, you know, the rules, the bylaws that we create, the area and the area we choose for our business to be located, the music that we play at events that we throw, where we do outreach, the books that we house, who are the people making decisions in this particular context, who are the decision makers, does everyone look like you, or is there a diverse pool of people? So all of that is systematic, right? And a lot of times we just don't see that, right? But we have to start looking at that in a bigger way. Questions? No? That's a lot. I'm telling you a lot in my 3-hour workshop in a 1 hour. Yeah. Who spoke? Oh,
Hi.
Hi.
So as far as like, I hear what you're saying about like, do all the decision makers look like you? What if you find yourself in a situation where like you and 2 other people who have been doing stuff together, right? Want to organize something together.
Right.
Now, it's not about keeping out anybody or not inviting anybody else in, but you've got a system that works.
Yeah.
And you all do look alike. What are your recommendations for still having outreach within the communities that you're trying to reach, but saying and acknowledging, yeah, we're all 3 white women, we're all cisgender white women, we're all queer, but like we've got all these privileges lined up,
right?
And we're acknowledging that.
Yeah,
so that's.
Well, I think that right there, you just said it. It's an acknowledgement, right? It's an acknowledgement of. So if you have something that's working right, then you can think about. First, think about, do you want input from folks? Because there's something that some folks do as well. It's like, we want your input on stuff, and we get people to say a lot of things, and then nothing is used, right? So naming that and saying who we are and how we want this to look, because even if you all look alike, in the programming or whatever it is that you're doing, you are you're making explicit that these things, like, I mean, like the event that's coming up next, it's like there's a POC tent, there's this, like when you, as a person of color, when I see this language, I'm like, oh, they're really thinking about this. There's a people with disability tent, there's a there's a POC tent, there is women in trans time in the dungeon. I'm like, they are thinking about how this permeates in the world, like that. Trans people might want to have a space by themselves, that people of color might want to have a space by themselves, right? So I'm thinking it's getting input or feedback from the community that you want to be there. And I think, and that might be in the form of putting a call out, doing a contest or something. But I think in whatever description that is put out, naming that these things are integral, they're important to you. That there's, a lot of people put, we won't tolerate racism, this and this and that, and these are the mechanisms we've put in place so that this wouldn't happen. Yeah, because I've seen plenty of folks that are say, we're white folks and we're organizing this, and anti-racism is super important to us, and this is how we as white people are working on this. Yeah. It's about like transparency, really.
Ignacio, so I agree with what you're saying. To take it a little bit further, and I'm sure you've thought about this, the mechanisms that are in place that keep these oppressive regimes flowing and functioning. I think part of the problem, if you look back to even the way the U.S. was founded, and I think it was the Federalist Papers. I can't remember from my political science courses in college. Yep, but they talked about dividing factions, and that's how you're going to control large populations and stuff like that. Also, I think whenever you keep the population in fear, you're able to keep them looking in different directions and blaming different people. And I think we have a lot of that. You mentioned capitalism. I would argue that we don't really have capitalism. We have a country that says we're a capitalist nation. But when you actually look into what capitalism is supposed to be in a free market, we don't have that. And when you look at democracy, I mean, there was a study that came out this year that said, well, if you really look at what we have in America, it's not democracy. We think we do, and that's a nice fairy tale to tell during election years, but it's really an oligarchy where there's power in the hands of a few, and we have these just fears in society, and that's really what it is, in my opinion, that's propping up these different oppressive regimes. It's the fear. And the thing is, it's not, we have a lot of symptoms, and we're talking about a lot of the symptoms here, just like pharmaceutical companies love to address the symptoms, but they want to keep you sick. And that's the way our society is. It's, in my opinion, and I could be wrong, that's just my perspective, but there's so many things out there where it's just, let's address the symptoms, let's keep everyone afraid of each other.
Right.
And that way we can hold the people who are at the top, like FIFA, for example. Right. Let's hold on to the power and, you know, keep it for ourselves.
Yeah, and this is why we have to do a lot of accountability, right? And I mean, I think this is something that people are learning how to do, and sometimes I don't agree with how people try to do accountability in a very public and way. Sometimes it's necessary if this is something that you've talked about a lot. But accountability is really important because lots of time things happen. People bitch about it, right? And then they're not being called out on their stuff, so they're not given the opportunity to do what they need to do to fix, right? So if you call people out, there was a paper that went around on the internet saying call people in rather than calling people out. You open up a dialogue, right? You open up a dialogue, and it also holds them accountable, right? Because now you have put that over there, and now I'm holding you accountable to this. And if they don't do anything, then there's a process that begins there, right? Kind of dismantling this structure that exists that is oppressive. And you talked about fear, and it is very true. We live in a fear-based society, and that is how, I mean, particularly when we talk about sex and people of color and poor communities, it's all about fear. When we learn about sex, it's like, don't have sex, you'll get pregnant. Don't have sex, you get HIV and die. Don't have sex, do this. And this is how we learned, you know, about this scary thing. It wasn't about sex is such a beautiful thing. It's a wonderful thing that, you know, orgasms are beautiful. That's not how, in my experience, sex was ever even brought about. It was this scary thing, and why is it so scary? And now I have to examine this, right? And we live in that fear-based society. So thinking about that, thinking about the fear that is constantly in our lives, thinking about oppressions that are all around people, and for some it's a few, and for others it's compounded, right? Then you have to start thinking about the work that you do and how you want to, if that is your choice, to connect with folks from different communities that have different forms of multiple oppression on them, right? Because when we educate folks, like just a quick thing, when I worked at a sex shop for 5 years, you know, people would come in and ask for certain things. And I remember I was there for like 2 or 3 years, and there was a point where I was like, oh my God, don't people know, you know, whatever it was. They're like, they don't know what their pussy looks like. What the hell? My God, this person's like 30 years old. And you're in it so much you forget. And then I think about it, and as they tell me their stories, and I'm like, of course they don't fucking know, because they didn't have sex education in their schools. What, sex education? What does that mean? That doesn't exist. You know, all of these things that are obstacles that were put in front of them. Like, we expect someone to come in knowing even about how to have relationships, how to communicate, how to do any of these things. You know, we don't get an instruction manual. These are things that we learn through trial and error most of the time. It's now that we're talking about it so much more openly. And while we're talking about this openly, and we could talk about our own experience, we also have to remember that our experience is not the end-all be-all, and that we have to think and expand our thought about how this works in different communities, and not make assumptions and not speak for a community, right? Because I think a lot of times as we want to be allies, we start thinking that we can speak for an entire community and know exactly what that entire community is going through, which is not true. It's a constant conversation, a constant interaction. And it's not just, I'm going to talk to this one person with disability, I'm going to talk to this one person of color, and I'm going to get all the information. And I got it. I'm an ally. I know what I'm doing, right? And I always say that allyship is, it's not an identity, it's a verb. Right? And so all of this stuff is about action. It's about action.
Thank you for this perfect segue to my question.
Mm-hmm.
I would love to ask you for action steps. Personally, I'm in mental health, so a therapist, and the one goal that shouldn't be so hard, but it's been an uphill battle with practices I've worked for, is having inclusive gender language on intake. And I feel like anyone like Harmony, like if you want to do simple but really effective inclusive steps, like that's one thing I want to promote, is just adding the gender and sex assigned at birth questions to your intake. It's like 3 questions. You can find them online. I can help you. But I was going to ask for other action steps. For personally, I'd love to hear about individual practice or couples practice action steps, but there's a lot of people who might work for organizations, so anything you can recommend.
I mean, I think that it depends on where you're working, what your structure is in terms of how you're going to do stuff. But I always say, anything that goes on the website, anything that's in your bylaws, your rules, what you believe in, right? Because when you construct your business or whatever, you are putting down what is at the core of your business. And so is this important to you? Naming race. I think a lot of people don't like to talk about race. It's a scary thing to say race. Oh my God, I'm not even going to mention that because we're all human beings. And I got to say personally, I fucking hate when people say that. I have to say, I hate it so much because of course I'm a goddamn human being, right? But when we say that, I think we erase these things. You know, if I went up to a person who had a disability and it's like, you know what? We are human beings. We are the same. That person might slap me, right? Because we are not the same. We are not the same. And to say that we are the same is just not true. It's like we might have similar struggles. Yes, we might have some commonalities there. We might even have the same tactics to work through that. But I don't know what this person is going through on a day-to-day basis, the struggles that they go through, right? People don't know the struggles I go through. Right, what I've been through, how I live life, all of that, and it also gets wonderfully complicated when we think about a lot of different identities and stuff that are coming out. I was identified female at birth. I'm genderqueer and I'm trans-identified. Right, how is my experience reflected in stuff like this, right? We talked about I lived as a woman for 30 years, and for the past 14 years, I've been, genderqueer and trans-identified. So does my experience as a woman completely get erased? Not for me. That doesn't get erased. That is a part of my history, and I'm the trans person that I am today because of the way I was raised as a girl, a young lady, as a woman, right? Those things are very important to me. But there's also a privilege that I hold now, right? There is a systematic form of oppression, and I'm being seen as a man. So what does that mean for me being seen as a man in this industry now? And so I have to think about that. But on top of that, I'm seen as a gay man, right? So that's also another layer, right? So it's about thinking about these layers. And I think a lot of conversations are good to have with folks, because you can't think of these on your own, right? Because if it's not your experience, then you're not going to just hash this up and say, this is what we have to do, right? This is what that community needs. This is what, from an outsider looking in, there might be some ideas that you could have, but you can't know that unless there is a connection. And when I say that if things are integral and important to you, it is about connection. It is about, I constantly ask people, do you have people of color in your life? Do you have people with disability in your life? Do you know someone that you actually say, I love you? Do you share secrets with them? Or you have a lover? Or is it someone you see at events here and there and say, hey, that person's really cool and stuff, and you like them, but do you actually have a connection with people from different communities, right?
Is there a place for health being privileged? So I haven't heard it yet. I'm thinking I'm healthy, but there are those who are sick, and I don't know how you would even define that. That word almost sounds negative. So I want to know,
I know.
cancer or have, maybe physical disability. I mean,
It might be. It might fit a little bit into body norm, and I also think it could fit into classism as well. Because when people are sick, right, and a lot of times don't have resources, health insurance, all these things to care for them, right. So I think there's a lot of combining things that can
sex and mental illness, or sex and like cancer, like illnesses you can't see.
Right.
Per se.
Right.
Sorry, that's what I meant.
Yeah. So it's like all of that, disabilities, classism, all of those things kind of put together. Yeah. Right. It's like how do you do work with someone, right? Because if you have this cookie cutter model that says this is what you have to do and everything, and you'll have a great sex life, or it's not gonna fly. And it reminds me almost, and I know I gotta wrap up soon, but it reminds me almost of when I many years ago when I started doing grassroots organizing, and I worked at an organization that I was one of 2 people of color, and we were talking about how to do outreach to get people of color to be a part of that. It was very problematic, but the person who ran the department said, we are going to go knocking door to door in black neighborhoods, and we're going to talk to people. And I was like, no, you're not. I was like, that's not going to happen. And I'm like, I am telling you that that's not the way, that you're not going to go into a black neighborhood, knock on people's door, and talk about LGBT issues. There's another way. Right. And so that's the framework that they've used for them, that it worked OK, but it wasn't going to work. Right. So it's like I started thinking about it even back then. And I was like, you have to be in community with people of color to talk about what is the best way to go to the community. If you don't have that connection, you're just coming into it from a different, almost looking like an outsider coming in where there's no connection there. So it's like being in community with people, talking with people, understanding that there are different methods. You have to change that cookie cutter constantly to fit different communities. Right.
Can you just tell them about the roundtable and about the survey?
Oh yes, I mentioned it in the beginning. I work for the National Center for Transgender Equality. 5 years ago, the National Discrimination Survey came out, and the report from that survey came out called Injustice at Every Turn. It, again, the largest trans survey in the United States and its territories, and the next one is coming out. So we've been doing a lot of outreach across the country, and like I said before, if you want to help with doing some outreach or telling it to your friends who happen to be trans or non-binary, please let me know, because we've been just pushing it out, and it goes live August 19th. So that's when the survey will be out. And we're hoping to get 20,000 trans and gender non-conforming, non-binary people to take the survey.
When does the survey close?
It's going to be out in the field for at least a month. Yeah. If there are any last-minute questions, I think I went over a little bit. It's ustranssurvey.org. It is not live yet. August 19th it will be live, but all the information is there, and you can sign up. Yeah. Huh? Oh, yes. So it's US. If you can see that. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Don't go yet.
You're welcome.
Do you want a hard blast? Do you want our whole like what?
No, that's okay.
Okay, I hope this business geekery was useful for you. If you'd like to continue with the brain sex, click on subscribe up here. If you want to follow me on social media, right here, ladies and gentlemen, next video below. And if you'd like your very own Sex Geek Summer Camp t-shirt, then just click right here, right now. Boop. Go ahead.